Such a wife, always nagging. Jeez.
Yep.
All right, welcome to the 1960s, everybody. Great.
Hey.
Oh, hey.
Woohoo. Go ahead and screen share so we can find out a little bit of the 1960s.
No, go.
My mom was born in the 60s. Yes, I'm used. Yes, the 60s is probably my favorite out of all.
All right, so
Same.
what's going on in the 1960s? John F. Kennedy was elected our 35th president of the United States. The American record company Motown was incorporated as Motown Records. The starting salary for a teacher was $5,000. It was $4,000 for police and $9,000 for an engineer. In New York City, monthly rents were about $200 a month, but you could still find affordable housing for $100 or less
Thank you.
a month. 90% of American households had at least one TV. Very important. 1960 Summer Olympics, Muhammad Ali wins the gold medal for light
Never
heavyweight.
making lips ever again.
In March 11th, Barbie's boyfriend Ken made his debut. 1962, goodbye Norma Jean. Millions of fans were shocked to hear of Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. Goodbye, Marilyn.
They are.
A slice of pizza cost 15 cents.
Jeez.
A McDonald's hamburger also cost 15
That sounds
cents.
very cheap.
Candy bars were 5 cents. All right, other important things going on. We are in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we now have started the draft. So if you are a gentleman, get ready. You are probably going to war. The fight for the civil rights. It's the big era for that. The struggle for the civil rights was defined in the 60s. Ever since 4 amazingly young Black students sat at the white-only lunch counter and refused to move. This then made the movement start spreading like wildfire. The radical 60s were also a big time of college protests. Lots of protesting, lots of anti-war, feminism, things like that. We started our big protests and trying to call for change. It was also the summer of love, as 400,000 young people went to Woodstock. Peace. All right, big thing that happened in the 60s is pop art. If you don't know what it is, you know what it is. It is still popular today. Pop art was a kind of shift from our abstract expressionism we talked about last time. It was very much about embracing the whole commercialism, discussing what was going on in America with the commercialism, looking for found objects, lots of bright colors, lots of mass-produced art. So it wished to rebel against our abstract expressionism. It was considered lowbrow art, like very lowbrow. Big on-screen painting, as I mentioned, comic books, took from advertisement, took from movie stars, things that were popular at the time. Here is a 1960s pop art poster that one of my students has made for their assignment discussing pop art of the 1960s. All right, this week I'm going to show a couple of videos because I think seeing pop art is better. Right, so they're a couple minutes long.
It was a time of optimism and post-war economic boom for many. Supermarket aisles were filled with consumer products. Advertising and glossy magazines told people what to buy and made them want to buy it. Movie stars filled the silver screen, giving rise to celebrity culture, and the youth fought for freedom.
Freedom!
Out of this new popular culture, pop art was born. Its subjects were celebrities, comics, cans, condiments, and cuisine. Its style was flat, colourful, graphic, and commercial-like. Pop art was
All those things.
How could soup be art? But pop artists were referencing a world in which people actually lived. And as Andy Warhol put it, everything is art. In the UK, Richard Hamilton was amongst the first to reference pop culture using cutouts from American magazines. He was followed by Peter Blake and David Hockney. Together, they celebrated and questioned all things American. Over in the land of the free, however, pop art was a reaction to the introverted nature of abstract expressionism. By filling their canvases with flags, targets, and tires, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns paved the way. Then, Andy Warhol burst onto the scene with his screen prints, taking reign as the king of pop. Roy Lichtenstein turned comic books into high art, and Claes Oldenburg turned toilets into cushions. Down under, pop art started as a reaction to the conservative state in Australian art. A group called the Annandale Imitation Group added odds and ends to their canvases in defiance. Later, the American and British pop culture explosion was embraced by Aussie artists like Martin Sharp and Rick Whiteley. By the end of the 60s, pop art's heyday was over, but its legacy had only just begun. A it was called popism. This new generation blended past and present pop culture and even borrowed or appropriated work from the past. Pop art is one of the defining and most recognizable movements of the 20th century. Today, it's more than a reflection of popular culture, it's a part of it.
All right, what are people's opinions and thoughts on pop art? I want to hear from you guys this week. You have the ability to unmute yourselves. You have the ability to talk.
You have the ability to use spacebar.
It's kind of
If you don't know what the spacebar is, it is this.
Talking. Christian, 1 second. Go ahead, Pal.
It's kind of neat because it takes kind of the ideas of fun and express and just kind of do what seems like it would be entertaining, but it takes it down from an elitist standpoint.
Yes. Very well said.
I really like the colors on it back then, actually. I like the colors on it, and I've actually been interested in pop art for a while, actually, when I was younger. I used to do a lot of that kind of art when I was younger.
Yeah, very fun colors. Very different from what we saw last week with Jackson Pollock in his very kind of muted down colors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so used to things having color. That's what I like about it.
Well,
I don't know
it
why.
started off thinking, oh, it's kind of simple artwork, which it still is in my head, but it actually does have some complexity behind it when you start to realize what goes on when you actually start getting into it like I just did today. And honestly, this could take me a long time.
Okay.
Pretty much only done the basic outline. It's just not even close.
All right. Anyone else want to talk before I pass it over?
No. Stop, please.
All right. I think fashion and music is up next.
I'm gonna have a really hard time, you guys, going quick.
Bias.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen, but I'm gonna go as fast as I possibly can. It is actually really. Oh, I might have to wait for Rebecca to allow me to share my screen. Rebecca, come back.
Yes, Tobias.
I think you have to allow me to share my screen.
Yeah, it says that everybody's allowed one participant at a time.
Host disabled, attendee screen sharing.
I can barely hear people because I'm having to use headphones so that my mom doesn't.
Okay.
My mom's currently
Try
sleeping
again.
right now.
Try it now. Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Got it. Okay.
Sorry, looking for my cord. I'm at 9%.
Okay, so I'm going to do my best to go fast. I want to start with where we had come from. So we came from the 50s, we came from the 40s, but the deal was in like pre-40s, we had all this technological stuff that was happening, like I talked about. And it was really important because nothing could happen until there was the technology that needed to exist. Then the 50s happened, and this big boom happens with the record industry, all these artists coming up. And really, we talked about this last week, it was a lot of like flashy lights and showmanship, right? And Elvis And the idea was like, let's put on a show, let's entertain people. And music was really focused on entertainment. But now we move into the 60s, and in the 60s, literally, like, it's probably one of the most important decades for all of music, because music stopped being this kind of like form of entertainment exclusively for everybody to just sell things. And like, it was a lot less in the 60s about putting on a show as much as saying something, and saying something maybe political, saying something emotional. And the person who comes to the scene is definitely going to be like, first we talk about is Bob Dylan. If you don't know who Bob Dylan is, after this, you need to go and look up some Bob Dylan songs. But Bob Dylan took this idea of, like, if we're looking at this showmanship, he stripped it down and he said, it doesn't need to be a show. It doesn't need to be this whole complicated endeavor. It just needs to say something important. So if you look at Bob Dylan's lyrics, they're more like poetry than they are even like a song. And he was seriously like a wordsmith. He was capable of doing some incredible things using the power of a song. And I think this is just a general theme throughout the whole decade, is that music really starts to say something, and it starts to shape movements. And just like the video said and Rebecca said, there was a lot of like counterculture happening and pushback and rebellion, and that was coming through in the music in really powerful ways. So Bob Dylan, one of them. I'm going fast, but I'm going to miss people. I know that. I'm just going to try to hit the top kind of bigger ones. Then we have like this band, the Grateful Dead, is responsible for a lot of that, like the kind of counterculture movement. And they're like in the rock and roll scene. They're maybe like hybriding between all these different genres, but I would say if we had to categorize them, they're in this like rock and roll 1960s counterculture. Like, look at all these people in the crowd. They're kind of just, they're there to fight back, to do their own thing, right? And then the late 60s is when Woodstock happened. So that's kind of the same like big music festival, all about kind of, you know, loving each other, but like, I don't know, rebelling. I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to say that, but for lack of a better word, that's what I'm going to say. So we have the Grateful Dead. Then, of course, we cannot talk about the 60s without the Beatles. If you do not know who the Beatles are, you probably are not a human being on this earth. The Beatles are probably like substantially the biggest thing that has ever happened to music ever. And they actually started over in Europe, and they got so popular that they were maybe one of the first groups to like properly span the globe instead of just staying to their region. So I won't even be able to touch on all the complexities that went into the Beatles. However, I will say this about it. We had talked about all these technological advancements that had happened and brought us to this decade. The Beatles were using the same technology, but they were doing it in totally different ways. And I think people were hearing music in a recorded way that had never been heard before, and that was blowing people's minds. On top of that, they were combining these thoughts from like Bob Dylan and other artists, and they were saying really powerful things. However, unlike Bob Dylan, this is my opinion now, but unlike Bob Dylan kind of came on the stage and he was like, I'm going to say what I'm going to say, and I don't really care what anyone says about it. I'm going to do me. Same with a lot of other artists that were maybe doing similar things. However, the Beatles were able to say really powerful things, but they said it and it was like somehow universal. Like they were saying things that all of a sudden impacted everybody, and it was able to live in both worlds. And that, I think, is why they are so renowned and popular, because of that powerful combo. And then we cannot talk about the 60s without Motown, as Rebecca pointed out. And I will say this about Motown. I could do an entire lecture on just Motown, but I think what you really have to look at here is that what would come after Motown is like basically the origins of hip hop were happening in the 60s. And in the 70s, they start to turn into disco, and we'll talk about that next week. But if it wasn't for this kind of like movement that happened in Detroit, which was Motown Records, it gave a platform to people that never had that platform, as I said last week. And they all of a sudden had the ability to say and do and make these songs that they were probably already like had in the chamber in a way, but they were all of a sudden putting them out there, and people were digging it and they were really liking it. And that was probably like the beginning of what would change music as we know it, specifically a lot of the rhythm-based music that would happen from then on out. Okay, I'm trying to go fast. The last thing, you all know me and you know that I cannot talk about the 60s without talking about synthesizers. So this is Bob Moog. He invented the synthesizer. It was first sold, the first one, in 1965. Bob Moog basically was like this awesome, we've talked about this in some of my classes, but for those of you that don't know, he was this engineer, but he was also a really creative mind. He started to think in both worlds as an engineer and a musician. And it wasn't until 1968, so the late 60s, that we had our first actual electronic music record come out. And believe it or not, I have the record. So I'm done with my screen share. This is the first record. It is called Switch on Bach. And this record was basically all of Sebastian Bach's classical music, but played on a modular synthesizer. So this was the first time that people started taking electronic instruments seriously. And that's a huge statement, because up until that point, it had just been like so abstract. People didn't know what to think about them. But it was that record that started to turn into, in the 60s, it wasn't normal at all to think about it that way. But in the 70s, we start to see it become more normal. In the 80s, and it just explodes. So it was like, that was the seed that got planted that turned into these other things. Okay, I'm done.
Take it away, Ronnie. Okie dokie. Okay, so I love the 60s as well. And when my parents were young, they moved to San Francisco. They were both hippies. My dad was a bass player in a band, and they moved to San Francisco during the height of that 60s rock and roll era. And my dad's band was sort of like the opener band, and he opened for the Grateful Dead. So that picture of the Dead where you see all of those people that Tobias showed. So I have pictures of my dad's band playing at stuff like that, and cool, like those old psychedelic music posters for concerts of, like, you know, Janis Joplin and the Dead and the Doors. So all these cool bands. My dad's band never really got super famous, but they were the opening band for all those. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, that was just like a little personal tidbit. I am also going to be quick. You guys know I tend to go long. So somebody let me know if I go over 10 minutes. Okay.
Stop.
So welcome to the 60s. I am going to mainly, oh, wait, I guess I should probably share my screen. Let me do that.
Just maybe.
Because you can. There. Okay. So everybody can see that? Okay. So I'm going to focus mostly on the mid 60s and touch a little bit on the late 60s. When you talk about the early 60s, this should look really familiar from last week. This new look shaped dress and the boxy Chanel suits. So this should all be familiar from last week. But I do want to mostly focus on the mid and the late 60s. There was, everything was kind of fun and space agey. They really wanted fun. They wanted lighthearted. They wanted this return to innocence. This was a pretty traumatic decade as far as, you know, we had just gotten out of the war. We were out of the Korean War. We were getting into Vietnam. There were multiple assassinations in our country. And so it became this really intense, scary time to be an adult. And so people didn't want to be an adult. They wanted to go back to their childhood. So it was called the youth quake, where even people in their 20s and 30s and even older people started dressing almost childlike. If you look at these models, they're wearing clothes that like a little toddler would wear. Men started dressing sort of like little boys going to church. And so with this sort of return to playfulness, the Beatles here, like Tobias talked about, became so popular because most of their music was very upbeat and it was fun to listen to. Okay, the British invasion. Last decade in the 50s, everything was all about Paris. Remember the poodle skirts and all the little poodle motifs everywhere, the big
even poodle hairdos. Everybody was obsessed with France. For the 60s, it's all about the British invasion, and they become very obsessed with anything English. So when it came to fashion, it was all about British fashion. When it came to music, they wanted to know what was popular in England, like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and the Who, and of course the Beatles. They were called the mod generation. They were like the 50s beatniks, that sort of cool kid vibe, you know, they were way too cool. I'm gonna skip this part. So the 1960s body ideal was manifested in a young model nicknamed Twiggy, because she was very tall and skinny. Diana Ross had that same body type. Patty Boyd, she was sort of like the muse for a lot of men in rock and roll. But really tall, skinny, sort of flat-chested, childlike bodies. Hair and makeup trends. Look at these crazy geometric hairdos. And the makeup, the women would pencil in their eyebrows extra tall to make them look very wide-eyed like a child, and they would pencil in above the crease in their eye. A lot of them did the big eyelashes on top, and they would even draw in the lashes in the bottom to make it very exaggerated and make their eyes look super wide. So, like I said, it was a return to the childlike innocence in an increasingly frightening world. And younger people in their teens and 20s, they were the boomers, right? So they blamed everything that went wrong in the 1960s on the older generation. And they did not want to think the way their parents thought, dress the way they dressed, live the way they lived. Everything had to be new and modern, and it was they thought that the old way of thinking was not meant for the modern world, and that there had to be a radical change and shift in thinking. So you get a lot of protests, right? So young people taking to the streets to make their demands known. Mary Quant was considered the designer of the decade. She is considered the inventor of the miniskirt, even though she isn't, but she made it very, very popular. Everywhere you went, women were wearing miniskirts in these bright, crazy colors. There's some more bright, crazy colors. And because they were wearing such short dresses, they couldn't wear stockings because the garter clip would show. And so they were wearing tights or like these little girl socks. Okay. So as an accessory, bright tights became super popular. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This became an iconic look as well, this kind of fun military. It's even being recreated today. Some of you in my class will recognize this lady, my friend Lynn. These are some other designers I work with. Oh, look at that beautiful girl right there. So bad. Psychedelic fashion. So another way that they were escaping stress and fear and anxiety was through drug culture, and that was mainly through hallucinogenics like LSD and mushrooms. And so the colors and the prints start getting wilder and more intricate and very psychedelic groovy. For menswear, the peacock revolution, guys start really dressing up, like wearing velvet capes with intense embroidery and bows, lots of mismatched and clashing prints and fabrics. Their hair is getting longer. So in the 50s, men wore very, very short hair. In the 60s with the Beatles, their mop top, their hair started to grow a little longer, and it was considered like super unmanly by the older generation. And so of course, if the older generation didn't like it, that meant the younger generation loved it. So as you get later into the 60s, their hair starts getting longer and shaggier, and they start growing mustaches as well. Check out the Beatles here. 3 of them have these long mustaches. Printed suits with paisleys, bright, crazy ties. It's a throwback also to Edwardian and Victorian era clothing. So they get this nostalgia going, and women were then started in the late 60s wearing high ruffled collars and these crazy bright prints. The hippie generation, when people go to costume parties and the theme is 1970s, you are guaranteed to see people dressing like hippies. However, hippies were from the mid to late 60s. And so it's really more of a 60s than a 70s thing. In fact, if by the 70s you were still wearing that, like in the mid 70s, you were still wearing clothes like this, you were pretty uncool or behind the times. So if you go to a costume party and it is 1970s theme, do not dress like a hippie. Okay, as always, the Ultimate Fashion History channel on YouTube is where I get my information and my images, and this lady knows her stuff. So if you ever want to find out more, she's got hundreds of videos. So that is my presentation. Did I make it in 10 minutes or under?
I think so. I didn't fall asleep yet.
Hey.
I think you're about a minute off.
I
on
lost
my
track.
So,
Ronnie,
good.
you were like just 30 seconds short of breaking your time limit.
Yeah.
You did it.
Job.
Got it. Oh yeah, wow, yes, the Birkin bags. The Jane Birkin, she was that same childlike model, and she always wore a basket.
She wore a Victorian baby doll dress and had a basket and flowers in her hair. And then it was like, okay, now we have
Wait, was
that.
she holding the basket in her hand or was it in her hair?
Yeah, quote unquote. She didn't have a bag large enough to basically hold all her shit, so her designer boyfriend made her one.
Yeah, and now
It go for now, Ronnie.
it is still the most sought after handbag in the world, the Birkin bag. Like, you have to get on a waiting list.
How much are they? Aren't they like
Thousands.
Yeah.
now they're almost up to like 10 grand?
Yeah.
Yep.
Grand?
They
Also,
only
like, if you want one, you'd have to go to Gucci.
they make a certain yeah, it's not Gucci, but they make a certain number a year, and
They're so cute too.
and then if you're lucky, you get on there fast enough. But that's why only really wealthy people and celebrities get Birkin bags.
Anthony, I think they look basic.
I mean, there's some cute ones, but
Yeah, but they're big, and that's the point.
They're cute.
yeah,
I don't.
they're the big B, big Birkin.
Yes, and tie-dye was, thanks Logan, tie-dye was very popular in the mid to late 60s because of that psychedelic groovy stuff, right? Everybody was dropping acid and tripping out and
Jeez.
Going crazy.
Yay,
I
colors.
was gonna turn this in for the thing. I made like a little Woodstock tie-dye shirt.
nice.
I
Perfect.
made
for
like 3 or
today.
4 of them. I know.
Impressive.
Picture and post it.
So cute. I made like, yeah, I'm gonna post it. That took me like 3 days.
Match my eye makeup, Anthony.
Oh, pick it up.
Yep, I'm just waiting because I just literally did a huge debt just recently. Oh, it's a doggo. Hi, doggo.
Doggo? Who has the doggo?
Hi, doggo.
That is my cue to stop recording when we hit animals. That's always when I know it's
Pretty much.
stop recording.
He was just staring